It all started with an almond. A single, unsalted, organically grown almond held between my thumb and forefinger like a holy sacrament. You have to understand, my back porch is my sanctuary. It's a small 10 by 12 foot rectangle of pressure-treated wood that serves as the buffer between my quiet, climate-controlled life as a work-from-home graphic designer and the aggressively manicured wilderness of the suburbs. And every morning, from roughly 8:05 to 8:20 a.m., this sanctuary becomes a place of worship. Me, the benevolent god of nuts, and him, the furry, twitchy-nosed acolyte. His name is General Eisenhower, Ike for short. Don't ask me how I know he's a he, or how he earned his 5-star rank. It's just a vibe he gives off. He has a certain gravitas, a fluffy tail that suggests authority. When he sits on his haunches on my porch railing, he doesn't just beg for a nut. He surveys his domain, assesses my generosity, and prepares to accept my offering as his rightful due. Our morning ritual was sacred. I'd hold up an almond. He'd hold up a walnut in his mind. We'd engage in a silent, telepathic negotiation over the day's tribute. It was the most important meeting on my daily calendar. "All right, General," I murmured, leaning back in my wicker chair, the steam from my coffee mug fogging the cool morning air. It's a big day. I have a major deadline for a new line of artisanal pickle labels. You have to find a place to bury this. We both have our pressures. Ike twitched his nose, his tiny black eyes fixed on the almond. He was a discerning client. My neighborhood, Maple Creek Estates, is the kind of place that was planned with a ruler and a crippling fear of individuality. Every lawn is a perfect, chemically green carpet. Every mailbox is the same shade of funereal black. Every house exists in a narrow spectrum of 50 shades of beige. It's the suburban dream, which, as it turns out, looks a lot like a witness protection program for people with no taste. My small patch of existence, with its slightly too long grass and a bird feeder that dares to be a cheerful, non-HOA-approved shade of blue, is my quiet rebellion. For 2 years, this rebellion had been peaceful. My neighbors and I operated on a simple principle of mutually assured privacy. You don't comment on my collection of garden gnomes reenacting famous historical battles, and I won't comment on the fact that your Lexus has never seen a speck of dust. It was a delicate, unspoken truce, but a storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm named Carol. The whispers had started a month ago at the community mailbox kiosk, the suburban equivalent of a Wild West saloon. The old HOA president, a mild-mannered retiree named Bill, whose primary concern was the annual petunia contest, had moved to Florida. A power vacuum was created, and into it stepped a woman who, according to neighborhood gossip, campaigned door to door with a measuring tape to identify non-compliant lawn heights. She won in a landslide, mostly because no one else wanted the job. Her name was Carol, and she was about to become the Führer of the flower beds, the Ayatollah of acceptable hues. I hadn't had the pleasure of a formal introduction, but I'd seen her from a distance, a stiff-backed woman with a blonde helmet of hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire, always walking with a clipboard. A clipboard in a suburban neighborhood is never a good sign. It is the international symbol for, I am about to ruin your day for a reason that only makes sense to me. But on that perfect morning, none of that mattered. It was just me, my coffee, and a 5-star general waiting for his breakfast. I tossed the almond. Ike caught it with the practiced ease of a professional, gave me a look that was equal parts gratitude and condescension, and scampered up the old oak tree at the edge of my yard. The world was in balance. My deadline was hours away. Life was good. It was the last truly peaceful morning I would have for a very long time. The sound that shattered my morning peace wasn't a gunshot or a car crash. It was worse. It was the sharp, enunciated clearing of a throat, a sound engineered to convey maximum passive aggression. I looked up from my laptop, where I was deep in the throes of deciding if a pickle should look jaunty or stoic, and saw her. She was marching across my lawn. Not walking, marching. Her knees came up just a little too high, her arms swung with rigid purpose. She wore a blindingly white tennis skirt, a pink polo shirt with the collar popped, and a visor that seemed to slice the air in front of her. And in her left hand, glinting in the morning sun like the sword of a fallen angel, was the clipboard. It was Carol, in the flesh. Ike, who had returned for a second round of negotiations, froze on the railing. He knew. Animals can sense a natural disaster before it happens. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice a finely honed weapon. "Are you the resident here?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, buying myself a moment to formulate a reply that wouldn't immediately get me fined. "Unless I'm in the middle of a very boring home invasion, yes," I said, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Can I help you?" She stopped precisely at the edge of my porch, refusing to step onto my territory, but close enough to establish dominance. She scanned my porch with an expression of profound disappointment, her eyes lingering on the slightly chipped paint of a railing post. "I'm Carol," she announced, as if I were about to be knighted. "Your new Homeowners Association president." "Leo," I replied. "Your humble subject?" The sarcasm was a fine mist. I wasn't sure if she'd even notice. She didn't. Her focus was entirely on the real criminal. Her gaze shifted to Ike, who was now brazenly grooming himself on the railing. Her lip curled in a way that I can only describe as pure, unadulterated disgust. "Our bylaws," she began, flipping through the pages on her clipboard with a terrifying efficiency. "Specifically Section 14, Sub-Article C, Paragraph 2, expressly forbid the attraction and harboring of nuisance wildlife." She paused for dramatic effect. "That includes rodents." She said the word rodents, as if it had personally wronged her, perhaps stolen her inheritance or keyed her car. Ike stopped grooming and stared back at her, his tiny paws frozen in mid-air. I felt an absurdly paternal need to defend him. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's General Eisenhower," I said calmly. "He's a decorated veteran of several harsh winters, and technically squirrels are Suridae, not Muridae. It's a common misconception." My attempt at biological pedantry was met with a glacial stare. "Are you being deliberately obtuse?" "It's my default setting, but I can try to dial it back," I offered. She was not amused. "This is not a joke, Mr. Leo. Feeding these creatures attracts them to the neighborhood. They chew on electrical wires. They dig up prize-winning petunias. They carry diseases. So do toddlers," I muttered under my breath. "What was that?" "Nothing," I said, smiling brightly. "Just admiring your dedication to the letter of the law. It's inspiring." My internal monologue, however, was far less diplomatic. Nuisance wildlife? Lady, this squirrel has better table manners than my nephew Todd, and he isn't constantly trying to show me a hilarious TikTok video he made. Ike provides a valuable service. He eats, looks cute, and leaves. That's more than I can say for most house guests. Carol was already scribbling furiously on a piece of paper on her clipboard. With a flourish, she tore it off and presented it to me. It was printed on a sheet of offensively bright, Pepto-Bismol pink paper. "This is your first official warning," she declared. "You have 48 hours to cease all squirrel feeding activities and remove any and all attractants." She eyed my cheerful blue bird feeder. "That means everything. Failure to comply will result in a $50 fine. A second failure will double it, and so on. It's all in the bylaws you agreed to when you moved in." I took the pink slip. The font appeared to be Comic Sans, a choice that was, in itself, a crime against humanity. An attractant? I asked, feigning confusion. You mean like my charming personality? Carol did not have a sense of humor. That part of her soul had clearly been surgically removed and replaced with a tiny, perpetually angry gnome who subsisted on rules and the misery of others. 48 hours, Leo, she said, her voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. She turned on her heel and marched back across my lawn, leaving a trail of righteous indignation in her wake. I stood there for a moment, the pink paper fluttering in my hand. I looked at the slip, then at Ike, who was still frozen on the railing. He tilted his head as if to ask, "So, are we still on for that walnut?" I sat back down in my chair and took a deep breath. The smell of freshly cut grass and Carol's smug perfume still hanging in the air. The peace of my sanctuary had been violated. My sacred morning ritual had been desecrated. And my general had been insulted. This wasn't about a handful of almonds anymore. Oh no. This was about something much bigger. This was about freedom, art, and the inalienable right to befriend a squirrel. I slowly read the violation notice one more time, then carefully, deliberately, crumpled it into a tight ball. I looked over at Ike, who had finally relaxed. "Well, General," I said, my voice low and determined. "Looks like we're upgrading your dining options." The war had begun. The first rule of petty warfare is that the initial counteroffensive should be an act of glorious, weaponized pettiness. It must be deniable, subtle, and designed to infuriate your opponent on a deeply personal level. My opening salvo was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. I went to the fanciest garden supply store in a 50-mile radius, a place where they probably piped classical music to the petunias. I bypassed the sensible, HOA-approved feeders and went straight for the pièce de résistance. A 3-foot-tall, copper-roofed, gazebo-style bird feeder with no fewer than 8 separate feeding perches and delicate, filigreed archways. It looked less like a bird feeder and more like a tiny avian Taj Mahal. I paid an obscene amount of money for it and spent the afternoon installing it on a prominent post in my backyard, directly in Carol's line of sight from her kitchen window. I then filled every single perch not with bird seed, but with the highest quality gourmet squirrel feed I could find. A decadent mix of black oil sunflower seeds, peanuts, cracked corn, and what the bag described as a medley of tree nuts. The final touch was a small, custom-engraved brass plaque I had made at a trophy shop. I screwed it to the base of the feeder. It read, "For avian use only. Squirrels are strictly prohibited. Violators will be gently nudged." Within 10 minutes, the feeder was covered in squirrels. It was a bacchanal. Ike was there, of course, presiding over the feast like a furry king. He and his comrades weren't just eating. They were lounging on the copper roof, chasing each other through the archways, and generally having the time of their lives. It was beautiful. Carol, predictably, was not amused. I didn't see her, but I could feel her rage radiating across the property line. The next morning, a new pink slip was in my mailbox. This one wasn't just a notice, it was an intelligence dossier. Taped to it was a photograph, clearly taken with a high-powered zoom lens, of Ike halfway inside one of the feeding ports, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated bliss. The $50 fine was circled in red marker 3 times. Beneath it, she had scrawled in an aggressive, spiky handwriting, "Further action will be taken." The 3 exclamation points felt like a declaration of total war. That night I couldn't sleep. Her victory, however small, gnawed at me. I paced my living room, the pile of pink slips on my coffee table mocking me. I wasn't just going to lose, I was going to be fined into submission over a matter of principle and nuts. I poured myself 2 fingers of a decent bourbon and sat down at my drafting table. The tools of my graphic design trade spread before me. I needed to vent. I needed to create. I started sketching. My initial idea was to build Ike a small, wooden box to keep him out of the rain. A simple, functional squirrel house. But where was the art in that? Where was the spite? The bourbon warmed my veins, and my pencil started to move with a life of its own. The simple box became a cottage. The cottage gained a porch. A tiny rocking chair appeared on the porch. Why stop there? A cottage needs neighbors. I drew a small Tudor-style house next to it, then a stately colonial. A town needs a center, a focal point. I sketched a grand town square with a magnificent oak tree in the middle. My actual oak tree. The idea hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so elegant, so profoundly, beautifully insane. I wouldn't just feed the squirrels. I wouldn't just house them. I would build them a civilization. A tiny, architecturally sound, aesthetically unimpeachable metropolis in my backyard. A place so charming, so detailed, so utterly delightful that no reasonable person could ever call it a nuisance. It would be my Sistine Chapel of spite, my magnum opus of one-upmanship. I grabbed a fresh sheet of vellum and started sketching with feverish intensity. This would be no slapdash collection of birdhouses. This would be a planned community. I laid out streets, parks, and commercial districts. My graphic design skills, usually reserved for making logos for gluten-free dog biscuits, were finally being put to their true purpose. I drew the blueprint for the town hall, a magnificent Georgian structure with a tiny clock tower. Next to it, Stash and Company Nut Bank, a miniature granite-faced building for all their hoarding needs. I designed a tavern, the Nutty Acorn, complete with a tiny outdoor beer garden, serving nut-infused water, of course. There would be a library, a wellness spa offering pine cone massages, and a community theater. It needed a name. A grand, dignified name. I scribbled it across the top of the blueprint in bold serif font. Welcome to Nuttingham. I leaned back, my heart pounding with a manic, creative energy I hadn't felt in years. I looked at the detailed plans spread before me. It was absurd. It was impractical. It was probably going to cost a fortune. And it was, without a doubt, the greatest idea I had ever had. This was no longer about me versus Carol. This was about art versus bureaucracy. Freedom versus tyranny. It was about creating a rodent utopia so perfect that it would make her beige-colored world collapse in on itself. I raised my glass of bourbon to the drawing. To Nuttingham, I whispered into the quiet of the night, and to the total, soul-crushing bewilderment of Carol. The next morning, nursing a slight bourbon-induced headache and a massive dose of creative zeal, I faced a sobering reality. I could design a squirrel city, but I couldn't build one. My practical skills topped out at assembling IKEA furniture, a process that usually left me with a handful of mysterious extra screws and a lingering sense of existential dread. If Nuttingham was to be more than a whiskey-fueled fantasy on vellum, I needed a professional. I needed a master craftsman. My online search began with a series of increasingly specific and bizarre phrases: custom miniature builder, high-end dollhouse construction, architect for tiny things. Most of the results were for hobbyists or companies that made prefab dollhouses that looked like pink plastic nightmares. But then, buried on the third page of search results, I found it. Tiny Tim's Timberworks. We build small dreams big. The website was endearingly old school. All wood grain backgrounds and clunky fonts, but the gallery photos were breathtaking. There were Victorian mansions no bigger than a microwave, complete with tiny, functioning window sashes. There were miniature log cabins with hand-carved stone fireplaces. This wasn't a hobbyist. This was an artist. I called the number. A gruff, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Frank. Hi, Frank. My name is Leo. I found your website. I have a somewhat unusual project, I began. Son, all my projects are unusual, he grumbled. Last week it was a historically accurate replica of a French guillotine for a history teacher's hamster. What have you got? I took a deep breath. So I want to build a city, for squirrels. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I was sure he was about to hang up. Instead, I heard a deep, rumbling chuckle that sounded like rocks in a tumble dryer. A city, he repeated, his voice suddenly electric with interest. Tell me everything. Are we talking single-family dwellings, or are we zoning for mixed-use commercial and residential? We need to consider traffic flow. Squirrels are notorious jaywalkers. I had found my man. An hour later, Frank was in my living room. He was a mountain of a man, with a wild gray beard that looked like it contained sawdust, secrets, and possibly a family of nesting birds. He wore a flannel shirt and overalls, and he smelled faintly of cedar and righteous purpose. He looked at my blueprints, his eyes scanning every detail with the intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray. Georgian Town Hall. Ambitious, I like it, he murmured, stroking his beard. This tavern. The Nutty Acorn. We'll want to use a nice dark walnut for the bar top. Give it some atmosphere. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming. This is good. This is damn good. But it's not just about the buildings, son. A city is a living thing. It needs infrastructure. It needs soul. It needs landscaping. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling my niece. Your niece? Chloe, landscape architecture student at the State University. Specializes in small-scale ecosystems. She's a genius with moss. You're gonna love her. Chloe arrived 20 minutes later. She was the polar opposite of Frank. Young, pierced, with bright purple hair and a laptop covered in activist stickers. She looked at my blueprints, then at her hulking uncle, then at me, and a slow grin spread across her face. So we're building a squirrel city to stick it to your HOA, lady? She asked. That is an eloquent and accurate summary of the situation, I confirmed. I'm in, she said without hesitation. I'm thinking native ground cover for the town square. A zen garden behind the wellness spa. We can make tiny rakes. And for the residential areas, we should use a resilient, low-growth clover. It's soft on the paws. The three of us spent the rest of the afternoon huddled over my dining room table, which was now covered in blueprints, sketches, and wood samples. The energy was electric. Frank was a whirlwind of practical genius, talking about load-bearing walls and moisture-wicking sealants for the 1/12 scale construction. Chloe was a font of brilliant ideas, designing miniature window boxes, cobblestone paths made from smooth river pebbles, and a drainage system to prevent the streets of Nottingham from flooding. I felt like the eccentric billionaire client, funding a project of beautiful madness. We were no longer just a homeowner and two contractors. We were the founding fathers of a new, furry republic. The windows, Frank declared, tapping the drawing of the town hall. We can't use real glass. Too heavy, too dangerous. We'll use high-grade acrylic. I can laser-cut tiny mullions to give it that authentic, divided light look. We need a public water feature, Chloe insisted, sketching furiously. A small, recirculating fountain in the main plaza. The sound of running water is very calming for agitated rodents, and it doubles as a high-end bird bath. Multi-use functionality. I sat back, watching them work. They were treating this with the absolute, unwavering seriousness it deserved. They weren't just building tiny houses. They were world-building. They understood. They got it. This wasn't just about sticking it to Carol anymore. This was about creating something. Something real. Something tangible. Something so exquisitely and painstakingly crafted that it transcended pettiness and became a work of art. "Okay," I said, pulling out my credit card. "Let's talk budget and materials. I want the best. This is going to be the nicest damn squirrel city in the continental United States." Frank clapped a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that nearly sent me sprawling. "Son," he said, a huge grin splitting his beard, "this ain't just gonna be a city. This is gonna be my masterpiece." I looked from Frank's beaming, sawdust-flecked face to Chloe, who was already sourcing miniature solar-powered LED lampposts online. The fellowship was assembled. The plans were laid. The budget was, to put it mildly, terrifying. But as I looked out the window at my quiet, unassuming backyard, I could already see it. The gleaming roofs of Nottingham, the bustling streets, the happy, furry citizens. It was going to be glorious. The next Monday, a large, unmarked van pulled into my driveway. Frank hopped out, looking like a lumberjack Santa Claus on a mission. The van was a mobile workshop, a marvel of organization packed with tiny table saws, miniature sanders, and drawers full of impossibly small hardware. The materials arrived shortly after. Fragrant stacks of miniature milled cedar, sheets of clear acrylic, and boxes of what looked like dollhouse shingles. The construction of Nottingham had officially begun. My backyard was transformed into a bizarre construction site. Frank, with surprising delicacy for a man his size, began framing the town hall. The sounds of tiny saws and hammers filled the air. Chloe arrived with trays of moss, clover, and miniature ferns, her brow furrowed in concentration as she laid out the foundations for the Acorn Plaza's Central Park. It was a magical process to watch, a tiny civilization rising from the grass. The Georgian facade of the town hall took shape, followed by the rustic, timber-framed tavern. They worked with a focused, artistic passion that was both inspiring and hilarious. I'd bring them out iced tea and listen to them debate the finer points of squirrel urban planning. "The main thoroughfare needs to be wider," Chloe would argue, gesturing with a tiny trowel. "We need to account for rush hour right before dusk. The acorn gathering commute can get congested." "She's right," Frank would grunt, carefully applying a dab of wood glue to a miniature window frame. "And we need to reinforce the roof of the nut bank. Those blue jays are thugs. They'll try a rooftop heist for sure." Of course, this flurry of activity did not go unnoticed. Carol's surveillance went from casual to obsessive. Her face became a permanent fixture in her kitchen window. I started seeing the glint of binoculars. Her casual walks with her terrified-looking poodle, Fifi, became hourly patrols along my property line. She'd march back and forth, her eyes narrowed, her mind clearly racing to find which bylaw this glorious spectacle was violating. On the third day of construction, she could take it no more. She stormed into my backyard, her pink polo shirt practically vibrating with indignation. Frank was on a stepladder, carefully placing the last shingle on the tavern roof. Chloe was meticulously arranging pebbles for a tiny street. "What is this?" Carol demanded, her voice an octave higher than usual. She gestured wildly at the burgeoning town. "This is an unapproved structure. Several unapproved structures. I'm going to fine you into oblivion." I calmly walked over, holding a tiny, half-finished lamppost. "Carol, good morning," I said cheerfully. "Isn't it a beautiful day for creating art? As I believe I mentioned before, this is not a structure in the traditional bylaw-violating sense. It's a large-scale, multi-piece lawn art installation, like a sculpture garden, but for an audience with a shorter attention span." "It's a slum! A rodent slum!" she shrieked. Frank peered down from his ladder. "Ma'am, I take offense to that," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The craftsmanship on these dwellings is impeccable. We're using Brazilian walnut for the town hall trim. It's naturally weather-resistant, and provides a lovely aesthetic contrast with the cedar siding. The structural integrity of this cantilevered balcony on the tavern is sound. It can support 3 adult squirrels in a moderate gale. I did the math. Carol stared at him, her mouth agape. She was completely unprepared for the technical jargon of a master miniaturist. Chloe stood up, wiping dirt from her hands. Furthermore, she added, the landscaping is designed to be environmentally synergistic. We're using native mosses that require minimal watering and provide excellent insulation for the foundations. This is practically a green-certified community. Carol looked from Frank's imposing figure to Chloe's confident, purple-haired glare, to my own serene, smiling face. She was outmatched, and she knew it. The 3 of us had formed a perfect, weirdly synergistic alliance against her beige tyranny. She sputtered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Bylaws, fines, property values, vermin. Are you anti-art, Carol? I asked, my voice laced with mock concern. Because this is a celebration of community, a testament to the idea that even the smallest among us deserve a beautiful place to live. Defeated for the moment, she spun around and marched back to her house, the poodle trailing nervously behind her. We knew it wasn't over. The next day, the pink slips in my mailbox were no longer single sheets. They were thick packets, citing dozens of obscure bylaws about non-permanent structures, lawn ornamentation exceeding 24 inches in height, and unauthorized landscaping alterations. I didn't even read them. I walked them directly from the mailbox to my new, high-end Weber grill, which I'd bought specifically for this purpose. I crumpled up the HOA violations, tossed them inside, and used them as kindling to grill myself a celebratory steak. I made sure to wave at Carol's window with my tongs. The smoke, thick with the scent of burning regulations and sizzling ribeye, drifted lazily across the property line, a fragrant message of defiance. The city was growing, and so was my resolve. Nottingham would be completed, no matter how many pink trees had to die to try and stop it. For a week, the war settled into a cold stalemate. Construction on Nottingham continued at a brisk pace, while the daily deluge of pink violation notices from Carol piled up in my kindling box. The town was really taking shape now. The public library, a charming little salt box structure, was complete. The wellness spa had its moss roof installed. Chloe had even dug a tiny, winding stream that trickled from a discreet pump into a small pond, which she'd dubbed Lake Acornia. It was idyllic, it was absurd, and it was driving Carol to the brink of insanity. I knew she was planning a nuclear option. I could see it in the frantic way she paced behind her windows, often with a phone pressed to her ear. She had failed to intimidate me. She had failed to out-argue my contractors. She was out of pink paper and options. So she did what all cornered despots do. She called in the government. First, it was a city code enforcement officer, a tired-looking man named Gary who showed up in a dusty sedan. Carol met him at the curb, pointing at my backyard with the frantic energy of someone identifying an enemy spy. Gary trudged over, clipboard in hand, looking profoundly weary. He took one long, slow look at Nottingham. He looked at me. He looked back at Nottingham. "It's a squirrel city," I explained helpfully. Gary sighed, the sound of a man who was 47 payments away from retiring to a small fishing boat. "Are any of the structures permanently affixed to the ground with a concrete foundation?" "Nope. They're on gravel pads, for drainage," I said, repeating Frank's talking points. "Is any single structure over 120 square feet?" "The town hall is about 4 square feet, and that's the big one," I said. He made a few notes on his clipboard. "It's lawn art," he declared, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Regulation doesn't cover it. Have a nice day." He trudged back to his car, ignoring Carol's sputters of outrage. "Round one to me." but I knew she wouldn't stop there. 2 days later, on a bright Thursday afternoon, I saw the black and white cruiser pull up to the curb. She'd actually done it. She had called the police. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a thick mustache and a world-weary slump to his shoulders that reminded me of Officer Gary. His name tag read Miller. The other was younger, sharp, and looked like she was desperately trying to maintain a professional demeanor. Her name tag read Sanchez. Carol was on them in a second, her voice a shrill symphony of complaint. "Officers, thank God you're here. He's built an entire city for them. It's a public nuisance, an illegal animal sanctuary. There are health code violations, I'm sure of it." The 2 officers shared a look. It was a look I would come to cherish, a perfect blend of, "Here we go again," and "This can't possibly be real." They followed Carol into the backyard, their faces impassive masks. Then they saw it. Nottingham, in all its glory. Frank and Chloe were there, putting the finishing touches on the library's tiny weather vane. They stopped working and watched, tools in hand. Officer Miller stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly took off his sunglasses, polishing them on his uniform shirt, as if hoping a cleaner lens would change the reality of what he was seeing. Officer Sanchez's professional mask cracked. Just for a second. The corner of her mouth twitched upwards before she suppressed it. "Sir?" Officer Miller said, his voice a flat, tired monotone. "What am I looking at?" I decided to give him the official tour. "Officer, welcome to Nottingham," I said with a grand, sweeping gesture. "What you see before you is a master-planned community. That's the town hall. Over there is our tavern, the Nutty Acorn, very popular. The building with the green roof is the spa. We're still working on the yoga studio. The Squirrels are very excited about it." Carol was practically hopping with rage. "He's mocking you! He's mocking the law! Arrest him!" Officer Sanchez had turned her back slightly, but I could see her shoulders shaking. She raised her radio to her mouth, her voice impressively steady. "Yeah, dispatch. We're on scene at the Maple Creek disturbance. It's, stand by." She cleared her throat. "Yeah, dispatch. It's a tiny city, for squirrels." A pause. "No, I'm not high." Officer Miller, bless his heart, walked the perimeter of Nottingham with the solemnity of a general reviewing his troops. He squatted down, peering at the tiny, perfect details. He poked the water wheel on the grist mill Frank had insisted on adding. It turned. "Did you build this yourself?" he asked me. "I had help from professionals," I said, gesturing to Frank and Chloe, who both gave the officer a respectful nod. "It's good work," Miller grunted. He stood up and faced Carol. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what law you think is being broken here." "Public nuisance," she insisted. "It attracts vermin." "So does my neighbor's garbage can, but I don't call a SWAT team," Miller sighed. He turned back to me. "Sir, is this on your property?" "Yes, sir, every last pebble." "Are the squirrels aggressive? Have they attacked anyone?" "Only with their charm," I said. Ike, as if on cue, scurried down the oak tree and sat on the roof of the town hall, nibbling on a nut. He looked majestic. Miller shook his head. "Ma'am, this is a civil issue between you and your neighbor and your homeowners association. There is no criminal activity here. We can't do anything." "You can't be serious!" Carol shrieked. "I'm as serious as a heart attack," Miller said, his patience clearly gone. "Now, if there are no actual crimes being committed, we have other calls to attend to." As they turned to leave, Officer Sanchez paused. She looked at me, then at the perfect little city. "Hey, do you mind if I get a picture of this?" she asked, pulling out her cell phone. "My kids will lose their minds." "Be my guest, officer," I grinned. She snapped a few photos, a huge, unprofessional smile finally breaking across her face. "This is the best call I've ever been on," she whispered, before jogging to catch up with her partner. I stood there, watching the police car drive away. Carol was frozen on the grass, her face a thunderous mask of pure, impotent rage. She had fired her biggest cannon, and it had turned out to be a dud. Not only had the law refused to side with her, but they had actively admired my creation. This was no longer just a victory. This was a rout. The balance of power in Maple Creek Estates had fundamentally and hilariously shifted. Nottingham was not just a squirrel city. It was now, officially, a police-approved squirrel city. The story of the police visit to the suburban squirrel city spread through Maple Creek Estates like wildfire. Officer Sanchez's kids, it turned out, were not the only ones who lost their minds. My next-door neighbor, a quiet accountant named David, caught me at the mailbox the next day. "Hey, Leo," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "My wife and we heard what happened, with Carol and the cops." He broke into a wide grin. "That was legendary, man. Absolutely legendary. We've been wanting to stand up to her for months." It turned out the entire neighborhood was simmering with anti-Carol sentiment. There were stories of fines for holiday decorations left up 2 days too long, violations for unapproved flower colors, and a particularly nasty incident involving the forced removal of a child's basketball hoop. I wasn't a troublemaker. I had accidentally become a revolutionary leader. Nottingham was no longer just my project. It was a symbol of resistance against the beige tyranny of the HOA. I realized I had a choice. I could savor my victory in private, or I could share it. I chose to share it. If Nottingham was a symbol, it needed a proper unveiling. It needed a party. That afternoon, I sat at my computer and designed an invitation. It featured a handsome, regal-looking sketch of General Eisenhower on the front. The text, in a flowing script, read, "You are cordially invited to attend the official grand opening and ribbon-cutting ceremony of the Township of Nottingham. Join us for light refreshments, for humans, and a celebration of community, architecture, and the indomitable spirit of the suburban squirrel." I printed 50 of them on thick, cream-colored cardstock, rolled them into tiny scrolls, and tied each one with a piece of rustic twine. The delivery method was key. That evening, under the cover of dusk, I walked through the neighborhood. At every house, except Carol's, of course, I left a small pile of premium nuts on the front porch with one of my tiny scrolls placed neatly on top. It was a message, delivered by proxy by the very creatures at the heart of the conflict. The response was immediate. The neighborhood text chain, which I usually kept muted, lit up with excited messages. The next morning, as Frank, Chloe, and I were adding the last few details, polishing the windows of the library, filling the flower boxes with tiny blossoms, a white van with a local news station logo pulled up to the curb. A chipper reporter in a bright blue blazer and a weary-looking cameraman got out. "Leo," the reporter asked, approaching me with a microphone. "I'm Susan from Channel 8 News. We got a tip about a rather unique community art project." The tip, I later learned, had come from David the accountant's teenage son, who had posted a picture of his scroll and nut invitation on social media, where it had promptly gone viral in our little corner of the internet. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, my backyard had transformed. It was packed. Dozens of my neighbors were mingling on the lawn, holding plastic cups of lemonade and marveling at the tiny city. Kids were lying on their stomachs, peering into the tiny storefronts. David was there, clapping me on the back. Even old Mr. Henderson from down the street, a notorious grump, was there, a rare, small smile on his face as he watched a squirrel carry a peanut into the nut bank. The Channel 8 crew was set up, their camera pointed at the town hall. Susan was interviewing a very proud and eloquent Frank, who was explaining the architectural principles of post and beam construction in squirrel-scale buildings. Chloe was showing a group of fascinated children how the tiny water wheel worked. It was surreal. It was wonderful. A few weeks ago, this had been a quiet patch of grass. Now it was the heart of a community, a place of laughter and connection, all because of a petty feud over an almond. I clinked a spoon against my lemonade glass to get everyone's attention. I stood on my porch steps, which now served as a grand stage. "Welcome, everyone," I began, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Welcome to Nottingham. Some of you might see this as a collection of tiny, well-crafted buildings, but it's more than that." I paused, looking around at the smiling faces. This is a testament to the idea that you should never let anyone tell you what you can and cannot do in your own backyard. It's a monument to creativity, to community, and to the fact that even the smallest voices, or in this case, the squeakiest voices, deserve a beautiful place to call home. A cheer went through the small crowd. "And now," I announced, "for the moment you've all been waiting for." Chloe handed me a tiny red satin ribbon that we had stretched across the entrance to the Acorn Plaza. "I officially declare the city of Nottingham open for business." I pulled a pair of gleaming nail scissors from my pocket and, with a dramatic flourish, snipped the ribbon. The crowd applauded. The news camera zoomed in, and right on cue, as if he'd been waiting for his moment in the spotlight, General Eisenhower scurried down the oak tree, ran across the newly opened plaza, and disappeared into the nutty Acorn Tavern. The crowd roared with laughter. It was perfect. The sound of applause and laughter was a siren's call Carol could not resist. Just as the celebration was reaching its peak, the gate to my backyard creaked open. A collective hush fell over the crowd as she stormed in. She was a vision in enraged beige, her face pinched, her ever-present clipboard held like a shield. She had clearly expected to find me alone, perhaps gloating in my backyard, so she could have one final, blistering showdown. The sight of dozens of her neighbors, a news crew, and a full-blown party on my lawn seemed to short-circuit her brain. For a moment she just stood there, blinking in the late afternoon sun. But Carol was not one to retreat. She doubled down. "What is the meaning of this?" she screeched, her voice cutting through the cheerful atmosphere like a shard of glass. "This is an unapproved gathering, and you?" She pointed a trembling finger at me. "I thought I made the rules perfectly clear." Susan, the reporter, ever the professional, saw her opportunity. She smoothly glided over to Carol, microphone extended. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said with a bright, predatory smile. "You must be the HOA president we've been hearing about. Could you give us your perspective on your neighbor's charming community art project?" The camera swiveled to face Carol, its red recording light a tiny, damning eye. This was her moment to be diplomatic, to save face, to perhaps even spin the situation. She did not take it. Her rage, fueled by weeks of frustration, boiled over. "Charming!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's a disgrace! It's a rodent slum! He's violated sections 14, 28, and 41B of the HOA bylaws. This thing will destroy our property values." "All of you," she said, sweeping her arm to encompass all her smiling, lemonade-sipping neighbors, "are in violation just by being here. This rodent slum will destroy this community." No one said a word. They just stared. David the accountant slowly shook his head. Mr. Henderson let out a snort of derision. The camera remained fixed on her, capturing every second of her public meltdown. The reporter turned to the camera. "And here we have HOA President Carol," she said, her voice dripping with practiced neutrality, "who seems to have a different perspective on this project. which has clearly brought so many of her neighbors together today. That's when Carol finally seemed to realize where she was and what was happening. She saw the camera. She saw the pity and amusement on the faces of her neighbors. She saw me, standing on my porch, not angry, not gloating, just watching her. She had no allies. Her power, which was built entirely on intimidation and the tacit compliance of her neighbors, had vanished into thin air. Her face went from a furious red to a pale, blotchy white. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There were no more bylaws to cite, no more fines to threaten. She had been utterly and completely defeated, not by me, but by her own spectacular inability to let a man feed a squirrel. Without another word, she turned and fled, almost tripping over her own feet as she beat a hasty retreat back to the beige fortress of her home. The silence she left in her wake lasted for about 3 seconds before someone started to clap, and then the whole yard erupted in applause. The war was over. The Channel 8 news story aired that night at 6. It was a masterpiece of local news comedy. It painted me as a quirky, creative homeowner, Frank and Chloe as master artisans, and Carol, well, it painted Carol as herself, which was far more damning than any insult I could have come up with. Her on-camera meltdown was the clip they used to promote the segment. By morning, the story was everywhere. It was picked up by a national news aggregator, then a popular blog, and by the end of the week, a clip of Officer Sanchez admitting Nottingham was the best call she'd ever been on had 1 million views on TikTok. My little act of spite had become a viral sensation. Life in Maple Creek Estates changed overnight. The oppressive quiet was replaced by a low hum of friendly activity. People stopped to chat. Neighbors who had only ever given me a curt nod now waved from across the street. A petition was circulated, and while I never saw it, the rumor was that Carol was encouraged to step down from her HOA presidency for the good of the community. A quiet coup, fueled by squirrels. Her house went dark. The constant surveillance ceased. The pink slips stopped. Peace, it seemed, had been restored. Nottingham became a landmark. People from neighboring towns would drive by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Squirrel City. I had to politely decline several offers from local businesses to place tiny advertisements on the buildings. My life settled into a new, stranger normal. The commissions started rolling in. A woman from Oregon emailed me asking if I could design a miniature cat cafe for her pampered feline. A tech CEO from California wanted a scale model of his mansion for his pet chinchillas. Frank, Chloe, and I formed a small, improbable company, Urbane Rodent Designs. It was the most absurd and wonderful career change I could have ever imagined. It's been a few months now. The initial frenzy has died down. It's a peaceful morning, much like the one where this all began. I'm on my back porch, coffee in hand, my laptop open. Nottingham is thriving. The moss on the roofs has grown in thick and green. A small, tenacious vine is climbing the wall of the library. The squirrels, fatter and happier than ever, treat the place like the bustling metropolis it was always meant to be. A familiar face appears on the porch railing. It's General Eisenhower. He looks at me, his nose twitching, his expression as serious and regal as ever. I smile and toss him a cashew, a recent upgrade to the pantry. He catches it deftly and scampers off toward the town square. I lean back in my chair, the warm sun on my face. It's quiet. The only sounds are the chirping of birds and the distant, almost imperceptible hustle and bustle of a tiny city full of furry citizens. You know, for a rodent, you've caused a lot of trouble, Ike, I think to myself. But I have to admit, it was worth it. Every single glorious, microscopic shingle.